Camera rolling.
And action.
This is the 22nd of March 2016, interviewing for Meeting in No Man's Land. Can you tell us your name and a little bit about where you grew up?
My name is Alun Edwards. I grew up around Llandrindod in the middle of Wales, born in the 1960s.
And you've come to share several First World War stories with us. Could you begin by telling us about the principal people that you're here to talk about?
So the one story that I don't have a lot to tell you about is my father's father. He was Jack George Edwards. He joined up underage and served throughout the war and obviously survived. Now, I know he served in the war, but I know very little about it and have been not able to find out a lot about it. But my mother's family, her dad and his brothers both served. So her dad was Walter Powell, and his older brother was Percy Powell, who also served, and the eldest brother, Clifford Powell, went to war as well.
And you knew your grandfathers, is that right?
Yes, they both lived into very old age. My dad's father died when I was about 14 or 15. Didn't talk a great deal about the First World War with him at all. My mum's dad survived until I was about 25, 26 years old, and we were great companions all the way through.
And you say he's a bit of an inspiration, isn't he, to you in terms of history and
yeah, very much
the work
so.
you do today?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know any better, so I would just ask him questions, and silly questions, you know, about guns and whatever, as a kid. And he'd never talked to anybody, but he opened up to me, and we would just chat about it, not for history or posterity or anything like that. We just talked about it. He'd never talked to his wife or his daughter, which is my mum, but he told me about the trenches, and he told me about his brothers' lives. Both of them had died because of their wounds at the war. And the weirdest thing was I could never tally up his actual experiences with what I knew about the history, because he became a dispatch rider, a motorbike rider for an anti-aircraft battery, actually a London battery, a Cockney one. And he would talk about herring down these lanes on a motorbike, you know, and skidding to a halt because there was a group of Germans in front of him, turning round and racing away. And this didn't make sense to me because of all the trenches and everything like that. And piecing it together now after he's gone, what he knew about the trenches was from his brothers and from his friends, but actually he joined up underage, but he was not very fit. And he was held in different barracks in the UK, doing training and things like that, right until almost the end of the war. So in September 1918, he goes over where pretty much trench warfare has ended. So his tales of racing around at night on a motorbike now make complete sense. So that's where my interest came from, in history.
You were saying that yesterday we were talking, and that you actually used to go over to see him at lunchtime. Can you tell us that, which I love? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well,
It's an excuse for going.
Yeah, well, you know, as a kid, I'd just talk to him about anything, and he knew it chapter and verse. When he became much, much older, into his 90s, he was a little bit confused, and in his declining years, he retreated into his shell completely. So I was working about half a mile away and living in a flat on my own. So I would go at lunchtime to see my gran and my grandfather, and I'd get a nice meal, and I'd sit down with him and just chat. And I would be asking questions I probably knew the answer to, but if he was talking about the olden days, it was lucid, he was enthusiastic, he came alive. So for 45 minutes every couple of times during a week, that's what I would do with him. And obviously I loved that time with him. And that's what I remember him like.
Can I ask you a little bit about the village of Llandudrod?
Yeah.
Because you still have family, your parents still live there today, is that right? There's
Yeah.
generations of family that have lived.
Yeah, so Llandudrod is a very small town, right in the middle of sheep country, basically. But it's a town that was built up because of the tourism industry. It's a wells town, a spa town. And my great-grandfather, who is my grandfather's father, obviously, he moved there in about 1900. And on my grandmother's side and on my father's side, they've been there for centuries. My mum and dad still live there, in the house that my grandfather lived from about 1930 odd, which is only a couple of hundred yards from where he'd grown up. And my brother and my sister both still live in Wales as well, so we meet up very often, quite frequently. We're all back together as a family. And my wife's family moved to that part of the world as well, so that's where I met her.
It's a very strong connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Still today.
Yeah.
You've brought photographs of your grandfathers and your uncles. Can you just give us a picture of what work were they educated? What was their work before the war? Do you know much about that?
Yeah. So after a varied career, their father became an ironmonger in this town, which is going to be everything from machinery to mechanics, selling fuel, as well as an ironmonger shop. The eldest of the three brothers is obviously very well educated, only to sort of grammar school level, and then the war comes along. The other two, my grandfather in particular, I suspect left school at 14 and served an apprenticeship with the ironmongers. The middle brother I don't know a great deal about, but I'm assuming he was pretty much the same, sort of 14-year-old leaving school and joining the family business.
Now, as a boy, you became interested in the First World War. But was there, I think, some sort of like a veterans clubs or places that your grandfather would go to?
Yeah, well, he was a founder member of what became known as TOC H, which is the Tubby Clayton-inspired charity. In Poppering in Belgium, he had this estaminet, which was, you entered there and there was no rank involved. Officers would mix with soldiers. It was a Christian organisation, but it was about every soldier. And they returned from the war and set up their own little branches like this, which became formalised in the 1930s.
Is this the place with the church at the top in Poppering Gate?
I've never been there.
Like a chapel.
Yes, there's a chapel and there's an organ, yeah, and they've renovated it quite recently to coincide with the commemorations for the centenary.
So did you start to go along with your grandfather?
Well, he was relatively fragile by his sort of 80s, so he wouldn't be involved in their meetings other than as a sort of president, leading the prayers and things like that. But they had a bookshop in town, which I volunteered at. So I'd be sitting there with, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe 10 of these old veterans, chatting around, about their First World War, and obviously there'd be some Second World War guys there as well. I don't remember selling many books. It literally was, I'm just going to sit there and take all this in, because they were wonderful. And most of them really nice old boys as well. So that was my Saturday, volunteering. It was brilliant.
That's like a dream Saturday job, isn't it?
It is, yes. I mean, I love books anyway, so I probably bought more books than I sold. But, they were lovely to me. They knew who I was. They knew who my grandfather was. So there was a bit of that. but really it was just lovely to be around them. And I'd watch the rugby with some of them, at different times, or have a coffee with them at different times. So it wasn't just that sort of Saturday afternoon thing. It was lovely.
This is a Welsh community, a close-knit community that you're describing, where you knew a lot of these people who were familiar and friends and so on. In terms of when the war started, can you tell us about the men in these photos? Did they serve with Welsh regiments, or did they serve with English regiments?
It's a town about 40 miles from Hereford.
Yeah.
So the recruiting regiments from Llandrindod went to the Montgomeryshire Yeomanry, or to, say, the Welsh regiments, but in general they went to Herefordshire. So one of these brothers served in the Herefords and was invalided out of the Herefords. The other one was in the Herefords and then the Monmouthshire and the Somerset Light Infantry. He's the eldest of the brothers who went through, 2 or 3 years in the trenches. And I guess as there were heavy losses, then a unit would be broken up and he'd be moved on to the next one.
It's all right.
Yeah.
Camera rolling.
And action.
So on the photographs, there's Clifford, the eldest, and as far as I can tell, he must have been at the trenches for 2 or 3 years. He would have joined the Herefordshire Regiment, was with the Somerset Light Infantry for a while, and on his medals it says the Monmouthshire Regiment. And I guess this is one of those occasions where a unit takes so many losses that it's broken up and the soldiers are moved around. He was quite an educated person. In his diaries, or in his father's diaries, it talks about him doing different courses and things like that.
Do you know how old he was at the beginning of the war?
I can tell you from a family tree, but he's going to be in his 20s, so 23, 24.
The oldest brother.
Yeah, I guess 20-ish, yeah. And then Percy, who's the middle brother, joins the Herefordshire Regiment probably at the same sort of time, but he was injured in 1916 and invalided out in early 1917. And by the summer of 1917, he had died.
Do you know anything about how that happened?
Well, I don't even know that he left the UK. I know that his eardrums were perforated, but I don't know in what situation. And I believe the death is from something like pleurisy or TB or something like that, which would have all been intermixed with, the life that he'd have led as a soldier in training. And then the third of the boys is my grandfather, that's Walter. And he's here with his older brother and the father and the mother. And I love this photograph because you've got the older brother in proper trench-going garb. You can see from his face, there's a little bit of, he's the older one, but he's also seen a little bit more, I believe. The younger, fresh-faced one is my grandfather. He served in the Army Service Corps, I guess as a driver, and he's got a different uniform on. He's wearing jodhpurs, whereas the other guy isn't. And he's also got this sort of affectation going on his button. I don't know if you've seen them before, but this is at the time of the funeral. So they would cover, in mourning, they would cover the second button in felt or fabric or something. So the trench soldier doesn't have this, but the one who's still training in the UK has this, which I think probably shows that he's been in the army quite a long time, even though he's just turned 19 by then. So I think he must have been in there 2 years already. But he's got this sort of soldierly thing going on, but you can still see how young he is. I also like it because I know these two are small, short. My great-grandfather was also very short, apparently. And my great-grandmother is there on a studio chair, but her feet aren't touching the ground. I just love that photograph.
And it's a mourning photograph.
Yes, yeah. They're both home on compassionate leave. I'm certain that my grandfather only made it home once in the first year of joining the army, and it was like 10 months into his service. And Clifford may have been able to come from France. I don't know if that's possible, but they're back with the family for the funeral, and that's the occasion of the photograph.
You have, I'm just moving down, can you just, this is your grandfather here, is this? Or
No, this is my grandfather.
This is your grandfather?
Yeah, which I'm assuming is taken at the same sort of time because they're similar studio portraits. And this is the older brother, Cliff, and this is Percy.
Do you know much about Percy from your grandfather, apart from the fact that he died during the war? He didn't talk about that.
Well, he talked about both brothers. Percy, it's more a case of, you know, the older brother and the fun that they had as boys. He told me all about, you know, how they play in the woods and do all this stuff. A local businessman sold them all Kodak cameras, which is, you know, where some of the other photographs come from. But it was a bit of a habit that he was feeding, because he sold them really cheaply, the cameras, but then they had to get the film, they had to develop it and all this sort of stuff. So he'd got them hooked, you know, so that all the brothers had these little cameras apparently. So I don't know a lot about Percy at all. Clifford, I know, was an artist. He had some of his paintings published in books. In particular, he was a wildlife artist. So he would illustrate bird books and things like that, which he must have been doing in his teens, because I'm not sure how much he could have done when he returned from the army, injured. So, but all I know is that they were loved and hugely respected, and their loss had a huge effect on the whole family, but especially the brother, my grandfather, who survived them.
Would you tell us a little bit about Clifford? Because Clifford, you have a particular story.
Yeah. Well, this little group of photographs is all we really knew of my grandfather's time in the war. Versions of them had been on the wall in his house. When my grandfather died, we found, first of all, his father's diaries, which are wonderful factual accounts. But we also found this tiny notebook. So Clifford comes back from the war probably about 1917 with pleurisy or something like that. Certainly his lungs are shot. And by 1922 he dies of tuberculosis, which I don't know a huge amount about. But in this little notebook are what he said when he was on his deathbed. The early writings are probably Clifford's. Maybe he couldn't speak, so he's asking for things, or he's saying, you know, things to visitors, or whatever. And they're in pencil, and then somebody else has written over them in pen to make it clearer. And then what follows are probably reports of what he said. So there's some lovely things where he's, you know, reassuring a family member or a visitor. There's poems that he's reading. There may even be things that he's saying, well, you know, when it's my time, this is what I would like to be read at my funeral. It might be even like that. And then it slips into probably delirium. He doesn't know where he is. He's asking for water, and I don't know why, but he can't have water. And they've literally written down his last sayings, which is incredible, which I can completely understand why my grandfather, maybe he never even acknowledged that it was still in his possession, but he certainly never told us about it. And we found it after he died, probably many years after he died, because we've started to put together some of the research. And, well, it's heart-stopping and lovely. It's what you hear in that book is a lot of the things that I would think about my own grandfather, because he was always described as a gentle man, a gentleman and polite and everything, but a really gentle man. And that's what you get in this. So at some point I'll try and show you some of those entries and maybe try and read one of them. I don't know.
It's a really, I mean, I know that you yourself have spent many years kind of collecting and experiencing other people's family stories of the First World War, but this is a very unique thing for a family to have possession of.
Well, I've not come across something similar, not like this.
And that it's 4 years after the war. It's 1922.
1922,
the war has stayed
yes.
within that family
Yes.
for a further 4 years.
Yeah.
You were saying that your grandfather was a fine footballer.
Yes, well, I think all three boys were.
Yeah.
And there's photographs of Clifford, the oldest, in various football teams during the war. And the youngest, which is my grandfather, Walter, came back from the war and restarted his civilian life, which included playing for the town and becoming captain of the town. So a lot of the stories I have are from his footballing days, including when the FA Cup came round, when Cardiff won. They did a sort of tour of the nation, and his friends stole the FA Cup whilst he was drunk and hid it from him. Told his mum where it was, so it wasn't. But he had kittens for hangover and kittens because he had basically lost the FA Cup. But he was good, supposedly. I think he was a left winger, and he got scouted by Aston Villa. He'd already been working in London and come home, I reckon, after Cliff had died, to be with the family. And when he got scouted by Aston Villa, I think he refused to go. He said, I can't leave the family, and I suspect, I think that was probably the right decision for the family, but I think he was probably good enough to cut it at that level.
What you're saying is that because his brother, he'd lost his brother, that he
Yeah.
felt it was his responsibility.
Well, both brothers, yes.
Both brothers.
And the father, my great-grandfather, he'd lost his other brother as well, who'd served. So as a family, a huge loss, and I think he stayed to be with them, which would have affected his prospects and everything from then on. But I think he was very pleased to have made that decision. That was really important to him.
Could you tell us about some of the other things that are on the table?
Yeah. I've got less to say about these because we never saw them. So we had these photographs out on the wall. So this is the button that my grandfather wore in his jacket always. So that's the TOC H badge, which is the light. And I don't know enough about the symbolism, but his he and his father gave the lamp to the TOC H branch in Llandrindod, and on the lamp is, in memory of Percy and Clifford. So I don't actually remember my grandfather wearing his medals.
You don't?
But he wore that always. So that was really important. From the photographs, I can tell that that's probably Percy's cap badge. He's
Yes.
wearing it in that photo. And this is my grandfather's cap badge, which has been polished out of all recognition.
This is the Royal Army Service Corps?
Yeah, that's right.
And this is the
Herefordshire Regiment.
Yeah.
And it becomes the Royal Army Service Corps after 1918, so he's obviously wearing that till he's demobbed in 1919. And then later on in his life, the Second World War comes along, and he serves again as a fireman in Mid Wales, obviously, but they're called to when the docks are blitzed in Newport and Swansea and Cardiff. So again, he had stories of, munitions fires there, and they would have arrived, 6 hours after the event, and they were still the sort of images that you see in the Blitz, basically, is what he was describing, and some funny times as well. So
these are their medals, but you're saying that you don't remember your grandfather wearing them?
No, I'm sure that I don't know that there was ever a reason. In my memory, he's probably too old and frail to attend the armistice commemorations. I guess I sort of remember him wearing the ribbon with just the flashes of the medals. But yeah, I don't remember him marching, I don't remember him attending. But he was a member of the British Legion, and he was president, or whatever the term is for TOC-H. So I think it was very much in his mind, all of that experience, but not as a sort of ceremonial thing.
Could you take us through the other photographs?
Yeah.
Just underneath here.
Yeah, so... Well,
Wow.
this again is Percy.
Studio photograph.
Yeah, so it's the other photograph with the cap on, but this is with the cap off. And this is Clifford, probably immediately after joining up. He's got the Hereford's cap on, he's got the swagger stick, which would have been a UK sort of affectation. The ones at the bottom are my grandfather, and a lot of people came to talk to him about the First World War, and often it was because he was the last in our town to survive from that generation. So they would come asking if he knew their great-grandfather or whoever it was, which was lovely. I did see the effects on him of reliving those things. So as I got older, I realised what my silly chats with him must have done to him. But if it was ever possible, he would lead the conversation round to this, which is when he was training in barracks near Chester and got picked out to volunteer for something. Didn't know what it was, had to be kitted out in this incredibly fitted uniform, a lot of fuss made of it all, certainly nothing he'd ever worn before like that. And the next day, he rolls up to do his duty and finds out he's a footman in the convoy or the cavalcade for the visit of the King and Queen to that part of North Wales and Northern England. So he held on to the uniform for as long as he could, and this is a photograph near Llandrindod in a friend's studio in this incredibly fine uniform with great coat, very poshed up hat, some kind of cane. I think the boots are his own, but everything else is going to be, and it's such a departure from other photographs that we've got of him in, ill-fitting stuff. I mean, he's a very small man wearing huge stuff, but they must have really poshed him up for that. So one of the things I might read at some stage is his account of that event, because although I think he probably did things at more significance, that's what kept his memory alive, was this time when he did something with the King and Queen.
Really stood out
Yeah.
for him.
When he came back from the war in 1919, he picked up his sort of theatrical roles. By the sounds of it, he'd always performed monologues, the sort of thing that everyone would have done, because it was, no television, no radio, you make your own entertainment. And so he joins a Pierrot troupe, and they go around all the convalescence hospitals playing to the soldiers that are resting there. And I mean, these are 1920s carnivals in the town. He's there in his Pierrot stuff.
Amazing.
In one place, he's got like what I'm assuming is a slapstick. And some of the recordings that I've brought with me are him doing some of the turns that he would have done.
Would you be happy to play a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
and I can give you it to take on the disc.
It would be great to hear him if you're happy to.
Yeah,
to play.
absolutely.
You've got, this is from the Second World War, is this the fire service?
That's the fire service, and I was telling you yesterday,
Oh, yes.
so this is a really tiny sort of box brownie photograph of volunteers, and my grandfather's dated it as 1938, and these are volunteers to the civilian defence forces. My dad's father, I don't know what he did in the Second World War, but he's obviously marching here. He's the one in the trilby, again, relatively small person, suit and tie. And actually, my mum's father is one row in front of him.
That's amazing.
So we've always had that photograph and known it existed, and had a vague knowledge, certainly of my mum's father, who at this time in the fire service. And then only a couple of months ago, somebody shared on Facebook a BFI video, and it's of this parade in Llandrindod. So it's hundreds of men and women, so there's nurses, a whole range of air raid precaution men and the fire service and all the rest of them, all marching around the town. And for a millisecond, you have this of my grandfather on my mum's side marching and my grandfather on my dad's side marching, which is, you know, we never knew existed, and I just wish they had seen it, because certainly my mum's father would have just loved that. And he was the sort of person who would have known everyone in those hundreds of people and would have been able to tell you something about every one of them.
And that's amazing, because see, and your parents were married 20-something years.
Yeah, in the
30 years
1960s,
after.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
30 years after that.
Yeah.
And the grandfathers together. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. It'd be lovely to see the film.
Yes.
Gosh.
So I'll share the link with you,
Wow.
and
Thank you.
I'll just check the back, but I don't think there's anything else.
Alan, would you be happy to play a little bit of your grandfather?
Yes, of course.
With us. And the Pierrot connection is really interesting, because on one side of the family you were talking about Cliff, who's obviously an artist.
Yes.
And on the other, and then his brother, who's obviously into theatre.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so there's very much a kind of
And
artistic bent.
the father built
Yeah.
the theatre in the town, which was connected with the Presbyterian Church. So he's got the job in his diaries of booking the acts, and such was good, and they had 300 people for the Welsh chapel service, and all this stuff going on. And then into the 1920s and 30s, my grandfather takes on the management of the theatre, possibly through into the Second World War. So he's got Tommy Handley and all the big names touring, and he you know, in his memoirs he talks about who was good and who was bad, and he sees a few of the really young ones in the rep companies coming through as film and TV actors, you know, in his old age. So Dinah Sheridan and people like that, he knew as a, you know, 18-year-old rep actress and things like that.
Wow, what a story! Gosh. And you have your great-grandfather's diaries, you were saying as well.
Yeah,
You
so
have-
they're here, but I don't know what to show you and what not really. So they're not transcribed as such, but I've written things which I thought were interesting. I'm not sure what you're going to be able to hear on this, but what I'll do is give you the stuff on a disc. I've got it on a memory stick.
Did you
Sorry.
record this?
I would have been around, but
Yeah.
no, a next door neighbour and one of his friends recorded it. So it's wonderful, because none of them know how to use the tape recorder. So there's, you know, 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning of, is it on? What, you know, all this sort of stuff. But after a while, they just let him run with it. And so, I don't know, there might be an hour and a half of this stuff. So I've got loads of it, which you can have, but I was just going to get you one of the songs, because it's short.
Do you remember him singing? I mean, did he sing songs? Did he do turns for the family, or was he very frail by then?
No, he wouldn't do turns for the family, but when we were really little, he would sing the songs from when he was little. So there's really weird stuff like, you You know Buffalo Bill's travelling circus?
Yeah.
So the kids didn't go to that, but the adults went. So things like the Swansea pantomime, the kids didn't go, but the adults went to the pantomime in Swansea. And then they'd come back and go around the piano and learn the songs. So he would sing us the songs from the pantomime or whatever it was. So, you know, in other recordings, I've got all that stuff. So he would sing that to us. But yeah, he would do some of these monologues to us, and they're slow, and they're, I don't know what the audience made of it, but it's a different world, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I've got a short joke, and I've got him singing.
That would be lovely.
And then there's loads more that you can take away and do what you
It'd
want.
be nice to hear.
So I don't have any speakers on this, it's just what the thing's got. Let's get the right things.
Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, somebody alone, just to us at twilight comes along through the song, comes along through sweet song.
Fantastic. That's heartwarming stuff.
And the joke is lame, but I love it. And it's just exactly his sense of humour, so I'll try that as well.
3 soldiers lost a battalion in East Africa, a Scotchman, an Irishman, and Guy the Welshman. They roamed the country for several days, and at last found a hunter's cabin. They'd used up all their iron rations, and Guy was boasting that he used to poach for rabbits and pheasants on the estates back in Montgomeryshire. One morning, he set out to find something to eat. After a while, he came to a clearing, and there lying dozing in the middle of it was a lion. Guy took one look and turned tail and fled. He was getting quite close to the hut with the lion in close pursuit. When his mates saw him through the window, they rushed to the open door. Guy was very nearly there when he tripped full length at the entrance to the open door. At the same time, the lion leaped straight over the top of Guy and landed in the hut. Guy, a true poacher, got up, pulled the door shut, ran around the outside to the window, and tapping it shouted, "Skin that on, butties. I'll be back with another in a minute."
Excellent.
So those are the shorter, more palatable ones. I mean, it's just very long monologues that he would deliver, which are lovely.
Is the theatre still there?
Yes.
Clifford Road?
Yeah, and still has panto, and the chapel is still there with, a small congregation.
So you must see it and see it through his eyes and your
Yeah.
great-grandfather's
Yeah,
and
very
their
much so. Yeah,
stories
Yeah.
and so on.
yeah.
Do you know whether he entertained troops as well when he was in the army?
Yes, there's stuff from the Battery Christmas party in 1918. So he knows what the rundown of the thing was, and he basically goes through, and the Padre stands up and does something, so he does what the Padre did, and so he did some of that then. And the Pierrot stuff is all to soldiers in the hospitals around the place. So it's,
There's this great sense of humour that comes through, and this great heart, but also this, as everything you've shared, this the tragedy that within the family, and that he had made the decision to stay and not go off and be a professional footballer.
yes, yeah, I think that's right.
I mean, looking just looking sort of at I suppose the issue of commemoration and remembrance. I'm just interested, Alan, how do you, knowing the stories of your grandfathers and your two uncles, how do you feel about how we in this country commemorate the First World War?
So I'm going to have to just check my notes, because I did think about this properly.
Yeah.
So I'll find my notes
Cool.
and remind myself, and then I'll come back to it.
Do you mind if I...
Yeah, please, because I
Do you
mean...
mind?
No, no,
Because I didn't want to...
No.
I was just...
And again, I've got that transcribed, but it is a bit difficult to read bits of it.
I was going to ask you, but I wouldn't dare have asked you on film because it wouldn't be fair, but would you be willing to read a piece that you, or poem or something which is in it?
Yeah, from this, I think it probably needs somebody else to say what's a good thing to read, which I've got transcribed, so you can quickly look at that.
Okay.
Because I don't know, it's so personal.
It's your choice, Alan.
Yeah.
It really is your choice. I don't think it's something for me to say. Gosh, that's remarkable. Sorry, we're just chatting.
Should we cut that?
Yes, do cut. Yes.
Yeah, camera rolling.
And action.
Can you tell us why you wanted to share your family history of the First World War, why it's important to you?
Well, I think certainly my mum's father's story is what got me inspired into history and finding out more about the First World War. And as I've researched, our children, when you look at their direct ancestors, there's 12 or 13 direct ancestors who actually fought in the First World War. Not from any kind of militaristic family, just normal families in the Midlands and in Wales. Which I think is quite a significant number. So it's just fascinating for me.
And the answer, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask the question. And do you feel that your on both sides, grandfathers, uncles' experience of the First World War has had a strong effect on subsequent generations within the family?
On me personally, a huge amount of effect. But actually, I think for my mum and my dad and for their mothers, I really think the Second World War had more of an effect. It affected them more. It affected civilians more. Everyone was involved. They all had families billeted on them, or evacuees, or soldiers. And the austerity immediately after the war was just took over everything, I think, for both sides of my family.
And obviously you're bringing your family story to share. I'm just going to stop there for one minute.
Yeah.
That you're bringing your family story to share with German descendants.
Mm.
How do you feel about that? How do you feel that these stories compare? And how do you feel about working with, sharing those stories with, I suppose, the descendants of former enemies of your family?
Yeah.
If that's how you see it.
I certainly don't see it as former enemies. My grandfather had friends who were German, and he even went over to Germany in the 1930s. And he had an abhorrence of Nazism and all of that. He talked about being shoved off the pavement by thugs. Then my father did his national service in Germany, only a few years after the Second World War. He went to Bergen-Belsen, for example, to see the site and that kind of thing. And then I've worked in Germany and I visited Germany and just been overwhelmed by the generosity and how friendly people are. So I'm hoping, sharing the stories just shows that there's a real common bond, at least with the families that went through this, whatever the politicians did. So I'm hoping this will be a chance to be friendly.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. We talked about perhaps reading something from
Yes.
here. Is that all right?
Yes, of course.
It's impossible to choose.
Yes, and I might have to pretend to read it from here, but actually read it from there.
That's fine. That's
Just have to work out where it is, sorry.
it would just be nice to hear, his voice, if that's possible.
So I'll just check if I can read it in...
It's extraordinary handwriting. It's a very
Yes.
fine handwriting, isn't it? Looking at it.
Yes.
Yeah. Beautiful
Okay.
handwriting, actually.
So this is...
Sorry. I'm really sorry, guys.
Don't be so there, you can't help it. Okay. So, yeah.
So this is written by Cliff Powell, and it's about 3 weeks before he actually dies. I've no idea if this is his words or if this is a poem that he's remembered. So the date is Monday, the 1st of August, and he's writing about Alpine Bridge, which is a very picturesque bridge over the River Ifan in mid-Wales. So, at Alpine Bridge, deep dark valleys had not been that way before, lost. Awoke over the hills, where am I? What day is it? What time is it? What has happened? And there's loads more that's, gets more and more personal. I don't really know. There's a Rossetti poem, which I don't know, but...
Thank you for reading it.
Yeah. But if I give you the memory stick, it's got those poems written out and his notes written out. So if there's something you want to record later or...
Just thank you for reading that.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Okay.
Thank you.